and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Tuesday, March 28th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined virtually in our studio by two writers who I've had a great deal of respect for and I'm really excited to have on our program today. James Fallows is a former national correspondent for The Atlantic magazine, and his work has also appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New York Review of Books, and the New Yorker, among others. A former editor of the U.S. News and World Report, was also a speechwriter for President Jimmy Carter back in the day, and is also writing a column on Substack called Breaking News at the moment. His wife, Deborah Fallows, is also a writer and also a linguist. She's a fellow at the New America Foundation and was an assistant dean in languages and linguistics at Georgetown University. James and Deborah, welcome to the News Project. Great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
I should say before we get started that between 2012 and 2017, the Fallows flew their single-engine plane across America to visit small towns, which became the basis of their book, Our Towns, which was published in 2018. The book was then made into an HBO documentary film in 2021. They went on to then start a civic foundation called the Our Town Civic Foundation in 2021. Jim and Deborah, thank you again so much for making the time for this conversation. It's rural America and rural issues have been a theme that we've explored a few times on our News Project programs. A lot of interesting stuff going on and a lot of issues to discuss as well. But I thought just to get us started, could you tell us what gave you the idea for the book and the way you went about doing it? That must have been a fascinating 5 years flying in a single-engine plane to so many towns across the country.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And the brief backstory, I think, has two main elements to it. One is that Deb and I have been together for quite a long time, to my pleasure, and including the previous several years, we've been living in China and traveling all around China, reporting on places outside the big cities of Beijing and Shanghai, where we were based. And when we came back to the U.S., we thought that there was a need, or at least an opportunity for more reporting of interior and small town America, not just as a scene for national political struggles, not just as guy in a diner stories, but ways to see sort of a three-dimensional portrayal of what was happening in small town America. The other backstory is that for a long time we'd had this little single-engine propeller plane, a Cirrus SR-22, as some of your audience may know, and we know there's places you can get to in America through small plane aviation that are hard to do elsewhere. So we began that now 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, saying, what would it look like in South Dakota, in Iowa, in rural Wisconsin, in upstate Vermont, if you weren't there doing just reporting a mainstream political story? So that's how we began.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what Jim said, just for full disclosure. He said we've been together a long time. It's actually more than 50 years that we've been married, 50.
Deb was a child then.
Well, congratulations.
So we thought, okay, we can try this. We can handle being together in a small single-engine plane for a while. We'll see how it works out. It obviously worked out just fine, and we're still here. So.
Well, the book is great. Like I said, I just really found it fascinating and went right through it very quickly.
Thank you.
I guess I couldn't help but wonder as I was going through it, how did you decide which towns to visit? Was there a certain logic to it, or was it just sort of, you feel like going to Iowa today?
Yeah, it started out very illogically, and it ended up with some sense of logic, I would say. At the beginning, we just had this idea, and Jim floated the idea on his blog at The Atlantic at that time, saying that we wanted to go around the country looking at some small towns with interesting things going on, especially maybe how this was a period of time coming out of the recession, so how they handled difficult things in their towns, if the factory closed or the mine closed. What we were wondering what they were doing or not. And to our surprise, within a week or so, we got probably 1,000 responses from people saying, come to my town and here's why, with these long, thoughtful messages. So we kind of didn't know where to start. except that we thought, okay, we'll go where we know a few people who could kind of help us with this idea and give us a soft entree. So we went to Holland, Michigan and Sioux Falls, South Dakota at the very beginning, and then kind of went across the upper Midwest. After a number of towns, after 5 or 6 or 7 towns, and the kind of gee whiz factor wore off of what we were seeing, we thought, well, maybe we should do this a bit more methodically. So we kind of made a geographical tour and then filled in with some towns that were a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, or where we missed the geography or might look, so we could fill in the map in a sense.
So, and of course, one of the towns you visited was right here in Vermont, in Burlington, the Queen City, as we call it. How did Burlington make it onto the list? What was the connection there?
So Burlington, I think it was one of those happenstantial factors. We'd been in the upper Midwest for a while, and we'd heard, of course, about Burlington, but not spent any time there. And what was interesting to us was the way that it had dealt, like many other northeastern or midwestern towns, with changes that came from a shifting economic base of mills closing, throughout New England, the ways in which towns had recovered, in which they'd developed their downtown, in which they'd made assets like the lakefront, of course, into big pluses, in which they tried to bring communities together, in which they dealt with the problems of this modern era, which Burlington has dealt with as much as any place, and the way in which they've included newcomers, that refugees were an important part of the Burlington landscape when we were there. And so I think that it was, in a way that people in Vermont might not always think of themselves, it was a representative city for a lot of other things that were happening. And I'll tell you later about the way in which we connected the leadership of Burlington with that of Greenville, South Carolina, a place that seems entirely different on the national political map, but they had a bond of just the kinds of things they were doing together to improve the town.
Burlington was really the first town that we went to where we started learning about refugees and how they were being integrated into the different towns and were so important in so many ways, from economic to cultural to culinary to empathetic. So Burlington was really a great kind of introduction and also test case for us to look at other towns who have big refugee populations and how they were handling them. So that, and educationally in the schools too. So that was a tremendous opportunity that we were able to visit Burlington in that part of its existence profile.
And the cover of our book, of course.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was one I've thought of a lot as I've done a couple of pieces on rural towns around our area here, and that's the question around what makes some towns kind of thrive and do very well, even in the face of adversity, and other towns seem to just sort of fold their cards and just, I won't say collapse, but just not, seem to struggle to kind of get back on their footing again.
So that's a really rich question. And in a way, it's the question we are trying to explore through the entirety of our travels, whether it was in Mississippi or the Central Valley of California, or looking across the lake from Burlington to Plattsburgh and the ways, the different situations of those towns over the past generation. And what seems to be the case is that there are a lot of answers to that question and then an answer to the question. So a lot of answers include, do you have any kind of educational institution that you can use as leverage, whether it's a research university or a community college or a liberal arts college? There's a whole bunch of answers. But in a sense, the answer seems to be, is there a core of people there who feel they care about having a town have a future, having a place where people want to come, recognizing its own particular identity, and also you can talk about heart and soul.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And the core of people, it is a very interesting core because it's sometimes you get the usual suspects, like maybe it would be people in the government, the mayor or the city manager or so forth. But sometimes that leadership comes from just regular people, like teachers or a librarian or the town historian or the museum, the people who run the museum, if there is one in town, or people in the PTA. It's the activists in the town who have a sense of, we're not finished yet. There is something we want to do we believe in this town, and we are here to help initiate and do what we can to get others come on board to make this a better place. So within that one secret are a lot of different composites of how that could work. And a next step, I think, is a more practical one. Once people just say, yeah, we love our town, we want to make it better, rather than just wait for somebody to come in and save us, is figuring out a way to do it. There is a group out of Vermont called Community Heart and Soul that has an actual process that helps people, especially in smaller towns, figure out the steps to take to get buy-in from the residents, to decide among themselves what's important to them, and then to design some practical steps one at a time to improve their town. But it's a very kind of ground up, bottom up process that helps a lot of towns get themselves organized in that way to overcome the, well, how do we start, what do we do question.
And I was wondering, are there certain challenges you see facing rural communities that are kind of commonplace? I find myself thinking that over the past 10 years or so, rural parts of the country and rural towns seem to have gone on a bit of a long, slow decline. At least that seemed to be the narrative. That urban areas were kind of where it was happening. That's where young folks wanted to go. I'm thinking here in Vermont, it was like kind of a case where, if you really wanted to pursue the most job opportunities, you went to a large city, Boston or New York or someplace. You didn't stay around at home. I mean, that attitude may be starting to change a little bit, but it seemed like for a long time, rural places were kind of just struggling to kind of just keep going. That seems to have changed, however, a bit more recently, and maybe part of that is due to the pandemic, because here, again, a lot of people, all of a sudden, we saw this reverse migration where people came out of the large cities and bought up every property they could find in around the state, driving up real estate values like crazy. Is that a pattern you're seeing elsewhere in the country?
So do you want to answer or
Sure, I'll start to answer. I think you're right on. We definitely saw, well, I would say that even before the pandemic, people in rural areas were starting to have more of a sense of pride and can-doism, and not to tolerate folks from the big city coming in to say, you're just rural folk, or not paying any attention to them. So I think the seeds of that were there and were starting. But once the pandemic arrived, you're right, we have remained in touch. We weren't traveling during that time like everybody else. It was where we were going to go. But we have remained in touch with a lot of people from a lot of the towns that we visited who were both surprised at the influx of people returning or figuring, hey, maybe we should try a smaller place for a variety of reasons, and seeing this as an opportunity to work towards some of the changes that they had, and seeing it as a reinforcement of the pride that they had in their rural lives. Hey, people want to come here. What should we do about that? How should we welcome them? How do we look at the challenges that we've got here? You named one of them, housing, that there isn't naturally enough, and provide the kind of lifestyles that would maybe keep people there just as well as keep young people there. So that's a rambling way. Maybe you can make more sense of what some of the things that the pandemic was good.
My only short addition to what Deb was saying is, of course, there's been not just a generations long, but a centuries long pressure on really smaller communities in the U.S. People moving to bigger cities for a very long time. In the last generation, there's also been big box stores and interstates and all the other things that have had the effect on smaller towns. But I agree with Deb that in the past couple of years, especially by the pandemic, people are thinking, where do we want to live? Where do we want to raise our children? Where are we from and where we would like to be from? And a lot of smaller towns seem newly attractive in that way. So it becomes now practical things like broadband connections and healthcare and schools, so that if young families are thinking, gee, we'd like to start over back where we're from, is it practical in those ways of connectivity, healthcare, and education? So that's something that smaller towns can do.
And also reinforcing the community that would welcome the new arrivals. A lot of the people who were moving to smaller towns were wanting to take their remote jobs with them, or were wanting to see this as an opportunity to do some kind of startup. But it was really part of the design of the places that they were going, that they needed to help these people. Jim mentioned broadband, that's certainly one. We've heard of a number of other communities that offer a kind of gathering space for people to share their ideas. Okay, you wanna start something like a coffee shop? Well, does this town need a coffee shop? What would we do with the coffee shop? What about the coffee shop that's already here? Would that be competition? To address it not just on a one-off basis, but a whole chance for a lifestyle shift and a kind of modernization in some ways, and certainly adding a lot of layers of complexity to the small towns to it's not just 10 new people are moving into town, but what do we do about that?
One question I wanted to run by you both was, among the challenges facing small towns, it strikes me is one around journalism. Small town newspaper is struggling to survive in the digital internet era. Having worked for a couple of small newspapers before I wound up on the other side of the camera, I find it concerning, I guess, because I really don't see the pathway out of that. Some of them have gone to a digital format or have strengthened their digital and kind of, the print paper is no longer kind of the main thing. But I also see so many papers closing down completely and so many journalists out of work. And I guess I just wonder, where does that lead us? And is there some way that those small towns can recapture that?
So that is, of course, another fundamental question, and not just for the economics of those communities and the papers, but for the whole fabric of democracy, to have people understand what's going on in their communities. And I think, as you well know, from your own experience and seeing things in Vermont, the previous model of small town journalism just doesn't exist anymore, with having the ad market come through Google and Facebook, and before that Craigslist, et cetera. So I think the challenge that's now underway is to invent different ways to fill this very important need for American communities and the American society. And you do find lots of universities finding ways they can try to gin up local journalism projects. You find lots of big foundations saying, we view this the way people 100 years ago might have viewed founding universities or museums or other kinds of arts projects. This is something that is important to American life, where the market model has just profoundly changed. There's something called the Alliance to Rebuild Local Journalism that's trying to get various kinds of tax incentives through. So I think that it's a time of tremendous experimentation. There's no one answer to this. There need to be 1,000 answers, and 990 of those answers are being gestated now.
And we've seen some really interesting examples. One is from DeSmet, South Dakota, which home of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Everybody probably knows those books. There was a family-run newspaper in that town for 125 years or so, that finally, they aged out, they timed out, they just couldn't manage to do it anymore. But the town wasn't going to stand for that. So with gumption and with a very philanthropic single backer to help get them going again, they restarted or continued actually with maybe just a little blip, the local newspaper with a total volunteer staff who just believed in it so much that they weren't going to let it go. So they did the reporting, they did the printing by hand, they did the deliveries. I think they started it online maybe.
But it's a weekly print edition.
But it's a weekly print edition. And that was a couple of years ago when we were watching this, but within a year or so, that was a going operation again. They really brought it up from, death throes to a strong, vibrant newspaper, both online and in print, because they wanted it, they knew they believed in it, and they recognized that the town would support it. So that takes a lot of guts to do something like that, and a lot of hard work. But we've seen variations of things like that that are also happening.
Our movie has a story of the Quoddy Tides in Eastport, Maine, which is a going, thick print newspaper in a small town.
I wanted to ask a question that's going to seem probably counterintuitive. One of the other things I've been kind of interested in is the whole question that's arisen kind of recently around the fact that rural states actually have disproportionate political clout in Congress because rural states have the same number of senators as New York or California, and the population gets over. Well, let's see how did this was put to me by someone. There are a lot of wasted votes in cities, basically. That the rural vote essentially counts for more than someone who's living in an urban area because of the way Congress is. You could say gerrymandered or whatever, but. Do you think that that's an accurate statement, or do you think, but rural areas have all these other issues they're struggling with, so, that's okay that they have a disproportionate share of the power structure in Congress?
So just as an observation, I'll make two observations. We're speaking to you right now from Washington, D.C., which contains more people than does the state of Vermont. Or does the state of Wyoming. And we in D.C. pay more per capita federal tax than any other jurisdiction. But there's no representation for anybody who lives in D.C., either as a congressional person or a senator. That's just how things are designed. Similarly, it's the case that my home state of California, where I grew up, has 70 times as many people as the state of Wyoming does, but has the same number of senators. And that's something that is just part of the design of American constitutional government, set up at a time in the 1780s when the biggest to smallest disproportion was 10-1. It was in Virginia versus Delaware. Now it's 70-1, California and Wyoming. And that is just one of the factors of American governance. So I think that it is that's just a reality of how things are. America, the U.S. has many blessings, like its position in the world and its geographically and its natural endowments and all the rest. One of the challenges for its governance is that something that was set up 200 plus years ago with a different kind of proportion now has varied effects. So it's just a reality that people in smaller states have more influence on national politics, especially in the Senate. So I would say use your influence and be proud of it. And also make us a state here in D.C.
And one other point of this, there's been so much talk about how polarized the country has been in recent years. Do you get a sense of that as you travel around in small towns? Does the polarization question kind of play out in the same way? I mean, I guess I think around here it's like a case where, if you don't know somebody, you're related to them, basically, and kind of, okay, we get into like conversations and arguments, but, it's not going to be, all, awfully horrible. But, when you read about some of the discussions underway or that seem to have us so politically polarized, I guess I wonder, wow, is it like that, not like that in other places, or? Has been your reaction?
Well, Jim may disagree. Well, I'll start out by saying it does not feel as toxic when you're on the ground in a small town as it does when you watch the evening news or listen to talk radio or other things where, this is kind of part of what keeps those institutions going. In small towns, I think there are a couple things going on that make life more pleasant. That one of them is that you're going to see those neighbors tomorrow at the school board meeting. That's a special case, right, with political things going on, or taking out the trash, or at the 4th of July parade. And you are all in this together in a small town, so there's a lot of reason to get along and to be more civil with each other than there is with the anonymity of what happens on a panel on cable news. So I think that that's one of the reasons that life seems more civilized and pleasant in small towns. The other is that when you've got issues that you're dealing with in small towns, everybody is maybe on different sides, but they know that they're in this together. If they want to talk about, let's fix Main Street, let's get more lighting for downtown, let's have more activities, places for kids for after school, or a gathering place for our community, they know that people in small towns operate in such a way that we got to do this together. So let's just focus on this task at hand, or what we've identified as important to us. Doesn't matter which party you're in or which side of which line you're on. If we want to do something, let's concentrate on that, and let's talk about that and leave this other stuff aside for the moment. Like what you were saying, that it is your national politics are out there, but they are much less a part of the everyday efforts and the sense of agency that people have, that I can do something in this small town.
Well, we have time for one last question, and I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about the Civic Foundation, Our Town Civic Foundation, that you're currently doing. What is its mission and purpose, and what's been going on?
So the mission is, thanks for asking. The mission essentially is to continue telling the story and connecting people around the country who are working on questions like local journalism. What are innovations that can make local newspapers thrive? Sustainability efforts. What can you do to either to have some influence on climate issues, and also to buffer your own community, the farmers, the people who are affected by heat or cold or by extreme weather. What you can do to deal with refugees, et cetera, et cetera. So we mainly want to continue telling, connecting, and making people feel as if they can think globally and act locally, and what are the effective ways to act locally. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
You got it. All right. Well, we'll have to leave it there for today. But again, I wanted to thank both of you, James and Deborah Fallows, for being with us and making the time for this conversation. I really appreciate that. And again, your book, Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America, a great read. Wow. Well, thanks again very much. This has been a real pleasure to talk to you both. Really appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Greetings to all up in Vermont, in the area.
All right. Well, thank you all for being with us as well. Thank you for sharing part of your day with us. And, well, we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, have a great day.